Everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Mark Horvit. I'm with Investigative Reporters and Editors, and it is my incredible honor here to be joined by Jim Steele. You probably know, but I'll give you the basics really quickly. Jim's currently a contributing editor at Vanity Fair magazine. Prior to that, with his longtime reporting partner, Don Barlett, he helped pioneer the use of documents and data in journalism when they were working at the Philadelphia Inquirer and other places. He's won way too many awards for me to name, but I'll mention two of them. First of all, a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, but also one that I'm particularly proud of is this June, he was the first winner of IRE's Founders Award, which is given for lifetime achievement in investigative reporting.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. So we're here today to talk about documents, and you've come to the right place, and we've got the right guy. So what I wanted to do is just start out with you sort of pioneered this whole idea that people should adopt what's come to be known as a document state of mind, and I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about why that was such a novel idea at the time, and sort of how you feel that works today.
Well, first of all, is my mic on as well?
Yeah.
So you can all hear me? First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about this. I sort of feel like a documents doctor in that sense, because I love to preach about them and explain them and get into them, and I myself continue to learn from people. It's one of the reasons I like to come to a conference like this, because this is a business, this is a field. It's always changing, always evolving, and there's always new things to learn. My own kind of journey in understanding documents was somewhat interesting, because when I broke into journalism and you wanted to find out something, you reach for the phone, you call somebody, you ask them the question. The idea that there was another way, just in the beginning, didn't occur to me. Eventually it did, and when Don and I began working together, we began using documents as the basis for our reporting. Now, a couple of things I need to tell you about this. This is not to the exclusion of interviews by any means. The two go together, and interviews are as important as ever. But the documents we found were a wonderful way to begin your study, because when you look at documents, you do a little research beforehand. And I realize with a lot of daily journalism, you don't have time to do that. But anytime you do have time, try to educate yourself a little bit. Know a little bit about your subject. You know the questions to ask somebody. And you can also find out from those, if you just schooled yourself a little bit, you learn right away whether or not the person you're interviewing knows what they're talking about. As we all know, politicians, other people in power, are constantly lying to us about various things. The one constant in my whole journalism career when I was interviewing people, I was always puzzled by, is this person telling me the truth? Are they lying? What have you? I found over time that they're not lying so much as that they just don't know what they're talking about. Have you ever noticed that, especially you see this on TV, where somebody will stick a microphone in somebody's face and ask them a question. This person then does not answer that question at all. And the reporter turns around and says, well, there you have it. And of course, you don't have it, because the person has ignored that question or is actually lied about it. So documents are a great way to school yourself, to understand things, and to check on the veracity of sources. And also, the other thing about them, which is very important, they will give you things that you cannot find anywhere else. I've often heard people say, well, nothing great is ever written, nothing put down in writing. That is simply not true, because you will find astonishing things in documents. I'll never forget when Don and I did a project on a Tax Reform Act, the tax legislation in the United States. We found some astonishing things buried in this law. I have to back up here a minute. If any of you ever have any trouble sleeping, have I got something for you to take. It's non-toxic, it's not non-habit forming, and it will always work. Read about 10 or 15 minutes of the U.S. tax code, and you are out. Barlett and I feel that years ago we missed our great calling, that we didn't patent one of these things for your neighborhood pharmacy. Call it Tax Code PM, because I'm telling you, it's absolutely foolproof. One night, reading this Tax Reform Act, further evidence of how exciting investigative reporting can be, and in it, start running across these paragraphs. I mean, this was an act that was supposed to be cleaning up the tax code, making it fairer for everybody. And in this, after a section that repealed this these really bad tax shelters down in the Caribbean was a paragraph that said, section above, the one doing the repeal, shall not apply to a company incorporated in Delaware on or about March 3rd, 1981, and owns one or more office buildings in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. Well, I was almost asleep that night till I read that paragraph, and that got me awake. Because and then as reading the rest of that act, we found these interspersed all throughout this 800-page piece of legislation. And we spent the next few months deciphering those, find out who the company was, who the person was behind those particular acts. So the fact, if anybody tells you that nothing significant is ever put in writing, don't believe it. So we've found over time that the color you get, the information you can get, the accuracy that documents will present to you is a marvelous thing in reporting. One of the things that I should emphasize, though, with documents, sometimes when people start using them, they're looking for what I would call the Blockbuster document, the kind of thing where somebody's filming a movie of you, the camera zooms right in, everybody sees right away what it is. Well, I'm still looking for that document for the most part, because what happens with documents, each one is like a piece. It's like a puzzle, and every piece is very important, but no one piece is always that outstanding. It's only when you get that mosaic together that then you can kind of see what your whole story is. And that's what produces a kind of frustration in people when they deal with documents, because sometimes those pieces don't come to you all at once and so forth. People, because we have used documents, and Mark had just raised this phrase, the document state of mind, which Don and I began using a long time ago. Because we use documents, one of the most asked questions that people is, well, you must know everywhere to look for these. The only time you know where to look for documents is if you're using the same documents over and over again. And the fact of the matter is almost every project is new. Yes, there are some financial documents that you look at in almost every project, same of land records. But frankly, every project is new. Everything is a new challenge. And very often, a document you will use in one story or one series, you'll never use again. No matter how much you loved it, no matter how much it produced for you. So how do you solve this? How do you deal with this? And we adopted what we call a document state of mind. We just assume the information is out there. It's simply a matter of trying to find it. But we assume it's there in one way or another. Now that's kind of morphed into a web state of mind, because so many of these documents, so many of these records are in fact now online. I'll give you just one example. We did a piece for Vanity Fair several years ago stemming from the airlifting of U.S. cash to Iraq at the outset of the Iraqi war. When the war began, the U.S. wanted to make sure that whatever currency was in Iraq did not have Saddam Hussein's picture on the currency. So the answer to that was to airlift U.S. dollars to Iraq, pay the civil servants, pay the pensioners, give other people walking around money, etc. Over a period of more than a year, roughly $12 billion was airlifted to Iraq from the U.S. to provide this money. It's a wonderful story. The money came out of the Federal Reserve Bank's warehouse in New Jersey, outside of New York, and this money was shrink-wrapped, just like you were shipping toys or boxes of detergent, whatever it is, on big pallets. All these were put in giant planes, airlifted to Iraq. Once it got to Iraq, a company had been employed to oversee the spending of this money, to supposedly watch out for this money. Well, this was a very strange company. When we looked into the documents, the company was in California. When we looked into the documents, it turned out the most significant task that this company had ever undertaken that was found on the record was that they had put recreation rooms and second bathrooms in houses in San Diego County. So here you have this company watching $12 billion, whose previous experience has been a home remodeler. It's these the kind of things that give the U.S. government kind of a bad name. Our government is not functioning. But anyway, the most interesting thing about this was, in the contract, there was the Pentagon had blacked out almost everything. Phone number of the company, we were able to eventually reconstruct this, so I won't bore you with all those details. But the one thing they did have was the post office box of this company. This Pentagon contractor's mailing address was a post office box in Nassau, the Bahamas. I actually volunteered to go to Nassau and run those records, which turned out to be very fruitful. There were more available there than you would ever think, contrary to what people think about some offshore stuff. Some places it is available. But here's the point I'm making about this document state of mind. We took, just as a lark, the post office box, ran it through an internet search engine, just one of those things you do. When you do documents, you're constantly opening doors. You're going to courthouses, you're going to other agencies, you're trying this, you're trying that. You very often have it's a dry hole, but you never know in advance. You just try these things, like we all do calling people. Same process. When this number was plugged in to the search engine, up pops a document from a bankruptcy court in Florida. And to make a long story short, that post office box that this Pentagon contractor was operating on was the locus of a multi-million-dollar offshore tax scam. So here we're able to then do the whole cycle. Not only are they not watching the money, the company doing this is somehow part of this giant scam, or at least knows about the people who set these things up, and you go full cycle. But there would have been no way to ever before the internet to have even made that connection. The document in the bankruptcy case was public, but there's no way in the world you're going to go through 150 bankruptcy cases around the country. Such a thing is impossible. So that brings me to just kind of a concluding thing, and then we'll go into some others. One of the things that's so wonderful about our age, while journalism is going through everywhere all kinds of upheavals and traditional media, some of it's going down, other things are coming up. We are in the midst of a golden age in terms of access to a lot of information. Not all of it, but the things we can do today by virtue of the internet, the things we can search are astonishing. I mean, so many stories in the past, when I wanted to do research, I had to get on a plane and go to some obscure place. Excuse me. Now, that information in court cases, other documents, readily available on the internet. That has opened the door to all kinds of reporting that was much harder, much more expensive, and very often impossible. Excuse me. How do I block this? Sorry.
It's all right. It's all right.
One of the points I make, so much reporting that used to go on in Washington, in a way, can now be done anywhere in the world. I'll give you an example. Anytime there's any major initiative in Washington, or in any foreign capital, I suspect at this point, the documents are immediately put on the web. Years ago, you had to go up and pick up a big fat paper document and run back and call somebody. Now, if you're a reporter in the most obscure part of the country or the world, and you're interested in an issue that one of these places is onto, you can then just immediately, thanks so much. Thanks. You can immediately have access to that in a way that was really much harder in the past. We're not here today to give you a long list of places around the world where you might find things. We'll have some later in our discussion today that we know things are available. But the main thing we kind of want to start with here is just think of this document state of mind. Every country, every jurisdiction is different, but almost everywhere that paper is to be found. You may not know what it is, you may not know what it's called, but chances are it's there if you give some thought to it and ask a few questions.
So that gets to one of the questions that I often get asked when talking about this is, how do you know where to start? You know, you've got a topic, you've started a story. How do you even begin knowing where to look to think about where something might be found, where key documents might be? How does that process work for you?
I mean, we start, frankly, just on the search engines now. just saying what's been written about a subject. We have no problem reading secondary sources. Many of those sources will point you to what will be good primary sources. The story I was just mentioning about this airlift of this cache to Iraq, it turns out there had been a congressional hearing about that issue. Pulled that offline, read that. There were some people who testified at that hearing that then became excellent people to call and interview about things that were not covered in the hearing. There were appendixes to that hearing that showed date by date when this cache was airlifted to Iraq. So we start first with the documents to find out, we search the subject, see what's out there on that, any official reports on it, start with that, any significant secondary sources where somebody might have talked about this. We just try to school ourselves as best we can, and then from those see within those stories any reference to a report or some other document. Again, that's the great thing now. It used to be much, much harder. We once did a...
في عيادته.
Did you all hear that, I hope? Okay, good.
No,
I feel better.
it's just you.
I'm hearing
It's just
voices
you.
now.
It's all right. That wasn't water Nils gave you, so it's...
Niels is a devilish fellow, isn't he? We did a piece on radioactive waste disposal many years ago, really before the internet, before all of these things. And you started the simple process of looking at congressional hearings, not only in the U.S., but then searching some foreign documents as well. France had been a big processor of nuclear fuel, so we were able to pull some documents from there, have some of the important ones translated. So you just start with those things. See who the people are, see who the experts are. We sometimes found experts don't know what they're talking about, but it may be a lead-in to finding more material about that thing. When you talk about what's available, you and I were talking about this a little bit at breakfast. A couple years ago, I was judged a journalism contest, and this gets to the heart of where you never know what's out there. This was by a journalist in Pakistan who had obtained tax records of every member of parliament in Pakistan. In Pakistan, apparently, don't hold me to this because I'm not an expert, every member of the parliament has to file a financial statement about what they own, I think their assets, but also what they filed in the way of, I guess it's not their assets, just they have to file their tax return. Members of the government have to do the same thing. Well, he was able to obtain information to the agency in Pakistan that received these reports. And you know what he found? 67% of the members of parliament did not even file these returns required by law. But again, until he asked for those, until he pulled them together, he did not know that. A good friend of mine, David Barstow of the New York Times, wrote a marvelous series on Walmart bribery in Mexico about 2 years ago, how Walmart officials were bribing local officials and others to grease the wheels so a giant Walmart superstore could be built next to a very revered and sacred monument in Mexico. And I remember, I'll never forget reading this story about the bribes that they had paid to these local officials in Mexico. And I'm thinking, how in the world did they get this? And you know how they got it? Mexico, believe it or not, has a Freedom of Information Act. Not only does it have a Freedom of Information Act, it's actually a much better Freedom of Information Act than the U.S. in terms of insisting on disclosure by various officials. And David and his colleague from Mexico wrote to, I think, 800 Freedom of Information Act requests to various local and state and I think federal agencies in Mexico. And from these, they've got financial records from some of these small towns in Mexico which were near where this huge facility was going to be sited. And they paired off the dates for some payments that Walmart had made to these places along with decisions those jurisdictions had made approving the permits, and used that to then interview people about what those were. and nail down the fact that these were basically just bribes to grease the wheels to get this done. But again, all documents followed up by interviews, of course. I mean, in a million years, I never would have thought such a thing would be possible. So that's what I want to emphasize. In a million years, I would not know everything that's out, don't know everything that's out in the U.S. The same approach we use in the U.S., I think, would be good anywhere in the world. You just assume it's there, you ask the questions, do that initial research first, and then start calling people to see who may have that stuff.
Well, you know, so in some ways, of course, the U.S. law is overrated for what it allows people to get. But a lot of folks who are here are from countries where the laws are significantly worse. So what advice do you have when either the law may not be on your side, or even when it is, and the government agencies or officials just push back and don't want to give you what you need?
I think, like, again, I don't know the difficulties that some people may operate under, but I think the first thing to find out, you know, do any of these records exist? Are these documents there? Even in some of these places where the documents are closed down, some material then does flow into courts. Litigation is very often a way to look at things, especially if there are groups within that country that have filed lawsuits or various protests about things that have happened. You can very often find things in that way. So you look around the side of things if an agency itself is blocking you. But the Pakistani story I referred to, those records were initially closed. And I think you know
The journal,
Umar
Chima, Pakistan, yeah.
My memory is he then appealed to one higher authority in Pakistan that was kind of responsible for the agency that received these documents, wrote him a letter, and they then opened them up. I mean, I think the first thing about all of this, none of it's easy. Even when you get the documents, they can be horribly tedious and time-consuming. Some unkind Swedish journalist one time came through our office in Philadelphia and wrote an article about us, and he said, Bartlett and Steele are about as exciting as watching paint dry. So, you know, this is what documents are like. It's a very systematic, slow process, but the end result can be very rewarding. So you look around the edge, you see who may have gotten things. I've got one Freedom of Information Act story to tell you about the U.S. We were doing a series many years ago about a famous industrialist in the U.S., now dead, a fellow by the name of Howard Hughes, who had huge ties to the federal government, even though he was one of these guys who hated taxes, hated government. One of his whole defense companies was 95% dependent on federal contracts. We once wanted to find out what they call foreign military sales contracts. These are contracts that the U.S. government approves for the export of certain defense materials to other countries. And his company made a tremendous amount of money with these. I remember calling the State Department, asking them, we understand you issue these. We'd like to get copies of these, send them a Freedom of Information. They called back and said, no, we don't have these. You must be mistaken. So they said, we think it's the Commerce Department. We called the Commerce Department. They didn't have them. We then called an outside think tank that had done some studies in this, and they said, yes, the State Department does have them. These records are found in room 6928 in Main State Department building. So I said, call the public information officer back at State Department and says, you in fact apparently do have these. Here's the room they're in. He goes away for a week or 10 days and he calls back and says, you're absolutely right. We do have these records. We're studying your request. We'll get back to you. So a week later, he gets back and he said, to fulfill your request, this was many years ago, this will cost $7,000 US. This would be the equivalent of about 30 or 40,000 today or something like that. So we said, okay, but before we write you the check, is there any chance you would send us one of these records so we can know what we're buying? So they sent us one sheet where everything was redacted except the name of Hughes Aircraft Company. So we, as much best we can figure out, we were paying $7,000 for black ink. But you try everything you can, and the U.S. law from time to time also will let you down, but you never know, which one will work, which one won't. And over the years, it's been more successful than a failure in that.
Can you think of, I was just curious, what was the toughest thing you ever tried to get? Can you think of one example of just the thing that was hardest for you guys to nail down?
Probably deciphering the identity of these companies and these people in the tax law was because some of the descriptions were quite obscure. Some would say, such shall not apply to a $200 million project in the Chicago River, so it was rather vague. So you had those kinds of things. Somebody once described us after that project as Egyptologists, deciphering these kinds of things. That was a tough one. Probably one of the other, I think, one of the other most demanding tasks we ever had, which I wrote about in the paper that they're distributing here for the conference. Back in 1972, we did a study of violent crime in Philadelphia. And it was one of the early computer-assisted journalism projects in the country. That was one where the information wasn't so hard to get. The problem was trying to assess that information, trying to analyze it, trying to figure out exactly what it meant. So that's what we have found to be the greatest challenge with information, whether it's data or documents. The volume of it is so great. The challenge is to try to keep track of it, to try to organize it, to try to figure out a way to categorize it. And people have asked me for years, what's your system? Mm-hmm. I remember once going to an IRE conference years ago where some guy had, this is like a long time ago, some guy had devised this thing where one document came in here, one went over here, a copy of it went down there, one went over here, one went up. It looked like the internal workings of your average desktop computer of a few years ago. Totally baffling, totally confusing. We've never adopted that. We've always kept very simple files. Proper names of companies, individuals, government programs, what have you. And then how do you know what to look for? Now, of course, the whole thing is easier because if you've got it all in a computer, you can search the terms in a way years ago you had to just dig through files. But what we find, there's something more important than that, and nobody ever likes to hear this. How do you keep track of stuff? You have to read and reread your own material. How many of you have ever gone out and tape recorded an interview, gone back, transcribed that interview, and heard things in an interview sitting there that you did not hear at the time?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think we've all had that experience. There's something about the mind can only absorb so much at any given time, for whatever reason. That same process applies to documents. Why the important ones must be read and reread. Because you can't index something in the beginning that's important that you don't know is important, which you find out 2 or 3 weeks later is important. And the number of times I have reread something, like the second or third time, and something then just jumps out like it's in red type. And I say, how did I miss that the first time through? So that to me has been the only way you really can systematically look at things over time. Read and reread those important documents.
I'd like to actually open it up, if we can, to questions that you guys might have. I was looking, there's not a mic, I guess. You can just, there is, in fact. There is, in fact, as I said, there's a mic. So if anyone just wants, if you just raise your hand, the mic will find its way to you.
Hi, I'm Sean from the UK Times. In relation to the financial collapse in the US in 2008, do you think that could have been averted by journalists digging into documents? Could there have been a better job done by journalists to just using documents alone to alert the public that there was something terribly wrong in the securities market that eventually led to such a collapse?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the beginning of that. You're talking about the 2008 financial meltdown?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of investigative journalists in America missed out on that, or they weren't really following it until it all collapsed.
Well, I think I think you're right, and it's there were actually some stories. I think Fortune magazine had some, if I'm not mistaken, and a couple of other reporters did. But what unfortunately happens in journalism, I think everywhere, there becomes this herd mentality. If everything is going right, people want to believe that, and it becomes sort of self-fulfilling. So yeah, I think there were a lot of things, especially in the secondary mortgage market. You look at that in retrospect, and you see how vulnerable that was in the United States. It's funny, when my wife and I bought our first house in the United States, we almost had to mortgage our firstborn child, who was not even born yet. I mean, that's how difficult it was. We went through a very, very rigorous process. By the late 1980s, into the 1990s, I should say, that whole process was reversed, because the folks who issued the mortgage were separated from those who serviced the mortgage. It's a complicated process, but when everything was together, people had an interest in making sure that person paid that mortgage, or if they couldn't, trying to work it out. When that process got separated, that was all there. It could all be observed. You could see that. So there was a lot there that people could have written about, but didn't. So you're absolutely right.
Hi, my name is Ruxandra Guidi. I'm a freelancer in Ecuador, and I used to be based in the States, and you talked about redacted documents, and one issue that I have in South America often is I get documents back that are where the data seems inflated, doesn't seem credible, as if journalists can get access to documents that are meant for public consumption, and there's other government documents that are not really made available to the press. So I wonder what kind of advice you have for this. I mean, in the US, we assume what we get from the government is credible information, if not redacted. But I wonder what your advice is for what your BS detector is for documents that don't seem credible.
Tell me again what your country is?
Ecuador.
Ecuador. I think probably and there's some of this in the U.S. as well. You don't always get everything, and you get what you have. I mean, the one I was citing on billions was 90% redacted. The little they didn't redact, we were able to use, and not just the mail drop, but there was actually a phone number that let us trace it back to San Diego County. So it's not always even easy in the U.S. But I think you just keep looking also at those groups around the edge of an issue like that to see if there's any litigation filed. I think that's one of the most important things. A lot of things are going to stay secret. There's no doubt about that. But I think you just keep trying to work as best you can to find out who, beyond just those government people, may know about this area. Who are they overseeing? What's the regulatory process? Is there anything down the line where there may be other documents filed? I'll give you an example in the States. A friend of ours at the Washington Post did a series about 3 years ago on the Washington, D.C. subway system. And what had happened was there were a couple of fatal crashes, and there was a big uproar, like, is anybody watching this system? And they made Freedom of Information Act requests to the governing body of the subway system there in Washington. And they denied these requests or didn't answer them. Well, it turned out that the subway authority was part of a metropolitan authority, and which never acted on this. It was just part of the process of various outlying jurisdictions contributed money and so forth. Well, each one of them had records about these inspections of the subway system. So when the main principal agency denied this strongly, by sheer luck they found out, luck is not the right term, by hard work they found out that these other agencies had these documents and were able to piece together. So you look to see, is there somebody else other than the one denying this who might have a piece of this story? And try to work on them, because very often they will help because they're not directly involved or responsible for that. So that's one thing to look. And never underestimate the citizens groups who also may have obtained some of that. That's another thing to look at as well.
Thanks. Do we have? I can't see if there's another. The lights are kind of bright. Talking about that issue. I mean, one of the things that you'd asked about was what do you do? It's sometimes it's not a denial situation. The situation is that you're given something and you don't know if it's complete. You don't know what they've given you and what they haven't given you. Email requests, I know people always worry about that. In the US, you can request email, and if it's sent from a public account, it's supposed to be public. But how do you ever know for sure that you've gotten everything? So what are some of the tests or the things you try to look at when you've been given information and you just feel like it might not all be there?
I guess, doesn't this guy ask good questions? Huh?
Great question.
I guess the first thing you do is that you just instinctively look to see, is that enough? And I think all of us probably from time to time know that an agency is probably not giving us everything. But when you find a particular part of that looks like it's missing, then you go back to them and just say, look, there's something missing here. Try to explain this to us, what you have, and go from there. But again, a lot of this also comes up in litigation. I don't know what the court systems are like in each one of your countries, each one of your jurisdictions, but courts almost everywhere, while maybe not always completely honest and straightforward, are also a very significant way to find documentation about what agencies are working. Also look to see what else do they have to report to. Anything in the EU, I know, a lot of those countries must report various things to Brussels. There's a lot of documentation in Brussels about a whole range of things. What other international bodies oversee the country you are from? I mean, the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington has a vast amount of information, economic information about Latin America and Central America. So try to think of those other places that may be able to fill in some of those blanks that whatever you've received, are there. I've never felt any time in any country, in any situation, we got everything we wanted to get. You always wonder what else is out there, but it is still amazing how many of these things are given. And half the trick is just never assume. Don and I years ago did a series on an oil crisis. Many years ago, there was a huge oil crisis. Oil prices shot through the roof. The Persian Gulf countries had cut off the supply of oil to the U.S. and a couple of other places, the Netherlands, and drastically reduced it to much of Europe. But we picked up some information suggesting this was not, and oil companies are putting out stories. This is in the 1970s, so do the math here. Companies are putting out stories. We've got 10 years of oil left. So look at the math today. We went back, looked through the National Archives, and found out about every 10 years, for 50 or 60 years, there had been oil crises. And every time there was an oil crisis, the industry said, we got 10 years of oil left. It was almost like there was a manual of this stuff that they told people about. But here's my point on never assume. As part of this, we went to various places that were key oil ports. And I've never forgotten going to Genoa, the leading oil port of Italy. A friend of mine was living in Italy at the time, knew Italian. So we went to the port and to see if they had any statistics during this alleged cutback. And we found this fellow in the very basement of the Genoa Port Authority. And as far as any of us could tell, he had never in his entire life seen a journalist. And we asked him about data during the oil shipments during the time there were cutbacks. The man could not have been happier. He wanted to share with us his numbers, his data. And we went straight to him. We didn't even go through the public information office. He was happy to see us. We asked him for the data. He provides it. The numbers were so stark, they were amazing. Supposedly at the time of a cutback, the oil had gone through the roof, the shipments. So I asked my fellow who was interpreting, I said, well, ask him about this. Supposedly, we're in the midst of this cutback in oil, and yet I see these numbers, they're nowhere near this, they're off the charts. So he asked him this in Italian, and the fellow starts laughing. And he says to him, it's a joke. The oil companies have it both ways. They think there's a shortage, so the prices have gone through the roof, but the fact of the matter is there's as much oil as ever, so what they're selling it at much higher prices. So it's the best of both worlds for them. And he was very matter-of-fact about it. It wasn't a scandal, this is just the way they were operating. But that was totally contrary to what perceptions were at the time. But the point being, never assume where you're going to find something, any more than you assume who's going to talk to you. It's just ask, and very often you'll get that kind of result.
Another way to think about figuring out if everything is complete or not is if they've given you some things, whatever it might be, and it looks to you like there's no way this could be everything that's there, is to follow up and sort of apply your own logic test, call them back. You know, they claim they're monitoring or they're doing something. How could they possibly do it if they're not keeping this information or tracking this information or they don't have this piece of it? And sometimes doing those interviews and showing that part of the story might be, you're supposed to regulate X. We asked for everything you have based on what you gave us. There's no way you're really regulating these things. There's no way you're really monitoring these things. And either forcing them to basically tell you that they're not doing a complete job or somehow finding those records they didn't give you that show that they are. So we have another question down here. Is the mic? Where's the mic? Do we need it?
Where's the mic?
Oh. Do we need it? I guess we need it.
Or if you, I'll repeat it if you want.
Yeah, we could just repeat the question too. It's okay.
Yes, very simple. My name is Ingmar. I'm a Norwegian journalist, business journalist. Make it short. When is the right time to publish? You collect documents, you go into a tunnel, and if you keep it to yourself, you can get a good story. If you start publishing, you can get even better stories, or you can fall flat. What's the right thing to do?
Well, like all good reporters, I try to hold off as long as I can. I think it's so... Pardon me?
Now what you have, the way the digital production is,
Pressure from the internet, yeah.
it's changing. You can't wait until tomorrow.
Right. No, I understand. Well, I mean, this is kind of the difference between what we have to do daily in journalism versus long-range projects. And I think everybody's worried about the instantaneous publication of a lot of material. There have been some terrible mistakes in the United States, hurting people's reputation and so forth, where the compelling need to do this. There's always been a little of that with big stories. I mean, some part of that's not new, but the whole thing is accelerated now. And I think everybody in the business is worried about that, because if you publish early, even though it's a major mistake, there can be tremendous damage to the person involved or the company involved if you're wrong, because people, for some reason, don't read corrections the way they read those initial outrageous stories. But on the long-range basis, let's say stories that take a longer period of time, I think that is accelerating as well, that in many cases there's less time being given to things. But the other side of that story was, in the U.S., when I broke in the United States, there was very little investigative journalism going on. While there has been investigative journalism for many years in the U.S., in the late 50s into the 60s, into the early 70s, there was not a whole lot. It was only in the U.S., it was the Vietnam War, followed by Watergate, that kind of sparked the modern era of people being curious. Suddenly, people saw examples where the government is not being as truthful as we thought they were. So things that were examples of this flaw. So that sparked a lot of the bigger stories, the longer range stories, the kinds of things my partner and I did, and many other papers did from the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the current era. So, but the question is always, when do you publish? And I think anytime you're doing a big series, there's always this danger that some piece of this will be broken off and spoil your series. That's just one of the occupational hazards of doing that kind of work. I've never worked on any series where I felt like it was really ready to be published. And I think every reporter will tell you the same thing. Because the more you look at things, the deeper it gets, the more you see, the deeper you want to go. But in calmer moments, I recognize the fact that that cannot go on forever. You have to do it. What I tell you, what Don and I did for many years, we used to save up everything and write it at once. And then many years after that, we changed and we began writing as we went along. It wasn't always published, but we began doing this to kind of flesh out a story, see where the holes were, see where the holes weren't in some cases. So that's the other thing I encourage people if they're doing a long-range project. Don't save it all up to the end. Get some drafts out. Get some pieces of the story out. See where it's going. I can't tell you the number of times I thought more reporting needed to be done, and it didn't need to be done. And I can't tell you the number of times I thought something was done that had a gigantic hole in it that you didn't know until after you wrote it. So write as much as you can, as soon as you can. It's a lot easier to rewrite than to get that stuff out in the beginning.
Do you keep backup files and hard copies of the documents which you have obtained throughout the years? Because obtaining thousands of pages myself in the last 15 more years, I live a permanent stress what will happen to these documents, and in fact my flat is getting more and more narrow for all these thousands of pages.
Well, bless the internet of late, because so many things anymore are now digital. I actually convert everything I get anymore to a PDF if it's an old lawsuit or something like that. So I'm not saving. I very often print it out to read it, but the saving of it is blessedly reduced in that sense. Don and I end up donating most of our papers to a university, the old papers, so they're preserved in that sense. But it's a funny story, when we moved from the Philadelphia Inquirer to Time magazine, we had 400 boxes of papers. I mean, these are things like this. And they teased us at Time. They said they had to reinforce the 46th floor of the Time Light building to accommodate us. But anyway, these kinds of things now are at least easier. I mean, it's more compact. Are you finding that yourself at all? Are you still, you convert anything, do you scan anything to a PDF form, or do you still? I know, the hard copy still, it's easier to read, and it's what? Old school, old-fashioned, I know. And I think sometimes in complex documents, you need to actually, the paper's easier. I don't think you can always read these on a screen. Of course, I'm speaking from an old school standpoint there, and if you're young and you can do that, it's great. I mean, I think that's the other thing about journalism. I mean, I've talked to you about some ways to do some of these things, but this is just the way I do it. I mean, everybody has to find out what works for them and what deals with they're most comfortable with. And that's important, because there's 1,000 different ways to do these things. There's no one way. I know people, some wonderful reporters, they cannot write a story unless they get that lead. I mean, unless they get that lead down, they're just blocked. And a long time ago, I figured I got to do something else here, because the lead can block me. So in any significant story, there are other things you can write about. It can be a personality, it can be a program, it can be a town, it can be a city. Write it out, write it, just get it out, because it's going to be part of that story. So, and I also find that's wonderful for your mental health, if you're blocked on the lead. At least you're getting some productivity there. Yes, sir. Good. Oh.
Yes, it's Wormdale Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. You mentioned that some documents is state secrets, but sometimes you get these documents anyway, or you combine documents that you feel is, you are close to what you feel is state secrets. Of course, it's editor's choice, to publish, and they have the responsibility. But how do you handle issues like this? You also have to do some personal opinion if you go on with this information.
I'm sorry, the last part I didn't quite get.
You also have to do some personal judgment if you're going to publish, if you are going to inform the public what you have found, which is delicate for the state.
Well, on state secrets, we'll do
Yeah.
two-pronged question here. That's a long-time issue in the U.S. when certain things would come up. I mean, years ago there was the famous Pentagon Papers case. There are other things that have to do with military and defense issues that the government very often doesn't want newspapers to publish. Some do, some don't. There have been some very courageous examples of newspapers that said no to government agencies and went ahead and published things. So it's an individual issue within the states. And you'll find many papers will not do something that is counter to the government. The Pentagon Papers, published by the New York Times and the Washington Post, were one of those real dramatic examples of where the government did not want something they considered national security published. And those two papers did, in fact, publish that material. And as you notice, the United States of America is still standing. Before that, there was another famous burglary, which is not even very well known in the United States, where an FBI office was broken into. And as a result of that burglary, it was disclosed that the longtime director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not just trying to catch bank robbers, but was in fact spying on citizens groups, students, civil rights groups in the United States, bugging Martin Luther King's hotel rooms, doing all kinds of things that had nothing to do with catching criminals. Those burglarized papers were then sent to various large newspapers. All of them turned back the papers to the FBI, refusing to publish those except the Washington Post. And the Post did publish those. And the minute the Post did publish those papers, then everybody else published them because that made it official. So sometimes it's the courage of a reporter and that reporter's editors and the publisher of that paper to make that stand. But very often, unless you have that, those kinds of state secrets will not be. And your second question was about... Well, the personal response, I haven't had one of a national security level of that significance, so I've not, but if I were, I think you always have to weigh the public's right to know versus what could happen. And I think you see that in the whole Snowden incident. I mean, there are a lot of disclosures out of Snowden that have nothing to do with significant national security. They're very embarrassing things for the United States. The fact we're bugging Angela Merkel's phone and things of that sort. But they're not really national security issues as long as maybe you're not releasing the names of people involved in sensitive operations. So I think everybody has to use a judgment in that regard. And I hope that if I was faced with that, I would do the same thing. But I think the public's right to know is, in my book, at the top of the list.
Hi, Fuad Yousefi at the Swedish National Television. I work at a program called Assignment Investigate, where we always, it's a TV show, but we always online publish the whole manuscript, and we always publish reference material, different obtained documents. And my question is regarding that. What do you think? Should journalists get better at publishing the actual documents, or are we actually publishing too much?
Well, I think we can now publish in a way too much because we have the technology. I mean, we can post things and people can look at things in a way they couldn't in the past. When Don and I did our tax break series that I mentioned earlier, I just think it would have been wonderful to have been able to had a link to the congressional law. So anybody who was really geeky and nerdy like the two of us could have dived into that thing and found their own tax breaks and so forth. It didn't exist at that time. So I think it's a good thing to make as many of these things available. But I think this should not be an excuse to then not do what we have always needed to do, which is to bring some insight into the issue involved. It's okay to publish the primary document, but I think people want to know what it means. And if we have looked at something for a long period of time, if we have assessed this, places I've always worked have taken the position, okay, let us know what you think about that. So in some ways, getting back to your earlier question, then it's not so much a matter of personal opinion, it's the personal assessment of this issue based on this much reporting. It's not just an opinion piece. It's like, here are the examples that to us point to this result. I think people want these kinds of things. I mean, the problems I see with a lot of newspapers everywhere, they're publishing bits of information that you cannot figure out the significance of. Why have you shared this with me? Give me some idea what this is about. Enlighten me. So I think the more we can do that, in whatever medium we work in, television, radio, we're going to be better off. Because people want to know what things mean.
And I'll throw in a very quick plug for those of you who are looking for tools to use to publish documents. IRE runs a free tool called DocumentCloud, which allows you to post and link to the tax code or emails or anything else that you want to use, and to annotate the document so you can give that kind of context that you're talking about. You can circle the parts that matter and tell people why they're looking at what they're looking at.
Right.
That sort of gets to the point. We probably have time for one more if we've got one. We're almost out of time here. If we have one last. All right. In that case, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Enjoyed visiting. And anybody has any questions afterward and want to talk about this further, look me up. I'll be around the whole convention, and I'd love to hear about your problems as well. And it's one of the great things about conventions like this. They're real two-way streets. I always come away with so many things that I did not know about. That's my motto in journalism. Tell the viewer, tell the reader something they didn't know. And I think if we do that, we've performed a service. So tell me something I didn't know, too.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.